next episode of our Data Center Direction podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Mason McPike. Mason is a executive director at Providence. He's been in the data center world for over 15 years, and we're delighted to have him join us today.
Hey, Sean, thanks for inviting me to the podcast. I've definitely followed a couple of your interviews and ready for your questions.
Fantastic.
Thanks for the intro. Just a little bit about myself and I've been in the data center kind of consulting space since like 2009. So, kind of approaching 20 years, and a lot's really changed. I think I was thinking about for this call, the first site I worked on was an enterprise data center, greenfield, for a builder here in North America called D.R. Horton Homes. It was, I think, 1 megawatt with a 1 megawatt critical expansion. And I used to enjoy and love those smaller, challenging projects, but now where I'm at Providence, we kind of develop for multiple use cases, including all the way up to like a 2 gigawatt campus. So it's been really interesting. And, I kind of made the transition over to the developer side about 9 months ago. Mainly had worked and done MEP engineering, land development, consulting, as a electrical and mechanical engineer prior to kind of switching over. So
Perfect. So you touched on it there. So you obviously, so you've moved over from, do you want to just touch a bit on your more on your background? I know you previously at Telios, weren't you, and worked your way up to one of the executive vice presidents there in the data center sector. So how did you kind of get into the space, and what does your role maybe involve day to day at Provident currently?
Yeah, no, I kind of just happened to stumble into the space. So I graduated with an architectural engineering degree, kind of set up to do consulting for commercial properties. And right around the time I got my license in 2009, just happened to stumble on a small facility. We hadn't really done any data center work and really enjoyed it. I was just kind of looking for something that was technically challenging that I could kind of grow into in terms of like, I wanted to focus on a vertical. And at the time, my firm was maybe 10 people. When I left, it was around 125, and kind of had grown from just offering consulting, which, Sean, I know you staff and fill roles in that area for, groups that cater to hyperscalers and developers like myself. But then also offered commissioning and like live facility retrofits. And then eventually kind of started moving into boutique development here in Texas. And that really piqued my interest, where I was like, hey, I'm really excited about developing a product, from start to finish, not just consulting for a developer in like partial capacity.
Yeah.
And, my old firm was successful in that transaction, that space. It was energy development and data center development. And I kind of just used that as a reason to kind of switch and move to a group that was going to do that at scale. And so that's why I'm at Provident now.
Yeah. So, and what does that, at a very high level, what does that role involve day to day, your remit?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to talk about that type of stuff because, I have a daughter who's in high school right now. And as I was growing up, my parents, provided every opportunity for me to kind of grow and learn. And I kind of actually had more of like a construction background in the trades as an intern. And so it got me thinking about, what opportunities are out there and how do I communicate what I do to other people, even those who are, haven't started their career yet. And what I would say, which is kind of interesting, as sites have, scaled an order of magnitude, right, over the last 8 years, let's just say 2016-ish, right, last 10 years, a 40 megawatt single building like in Northern Virginia was considered a pretty large site. And, a small site would be 4 to 5 megawatt retail colo.
Yeah.
And as that started to explode and grow, after COVID, what I saw happen was the risk profile of these developments and the capital being invested got so large that most developers regardless of their size and whether they were a merchant developer or an operator like a QTS, made the decision to de-risk these, by just hiring like subject matter experts on their development team, right? So whether you have a power person, that comes from a transmission background, a land development individual, that comes from economic development and has relationships, but then kind of moving into execution, they would be hiring, senior directors of construction, individuals like myself that in the past used to kind of leverage the consultant, the architects and engineers, pretty heavily to make decisions about product, procurement. And in all reality, these decisions just got so large and the demand for consulting services grew so quickly that those decisions really had to be taken away from the third parties. And you really had to build that competency in-house. And so I really enjoyed early pre-development, figuring out where a substation goes, what are the setbacks, can we effectively cool the site, making very large decisions for developers early in the process, right? And I just saw that kind of going more in-house and decided to kind of, pursue that. And so currently, we kind of have two platforms if you look at our website. One of them is we call Hyperscale. That's not a new term, but that is typically 300 megawatts of total load up to around like 1.5 gigawatts. And those sites are either powered land or powered shell developments, where we're doing mass grading, building the substation, building, 6 to 10 shells on the site, and then a hyperscale tenant does the fit out. That doesn't really align with my background. I'm more of a mechanical electrical engineer. I've commissioned facilities and, solved problems in the past, but it's been really interesting to kind of focus more on that.
The early stage.
But the early stage, large campuses that take 3 years of pre-development sometimes. But then we also have what we call an inference platform that is more like a 30 to 50 megawatt site that traditionally was used, maybe it was like a retail co-location facility, multi-tenant. We're now developing those parcels and infill sites for neocloud customers or just new businesses that are not investment grade, that are growing to the point they can't adequately be served by co-location. And so I want to talk more about that, a little bit down the road, but the commercial terms negotiation and figuring out how you can actually finance, a $750 million development with a group that essentially is a startup or, doesn't have investment grade credit is pretty challenging. And so, so my role is after we basically kind of like close on land and we move out of pre-development is to basically do all the product delivery, which includes OFCI procurement of the generators, chillers, cooling systems, the conceptual design, what I would call solutions engineering. So, we typically have an engagement with the tenant to figure out exactly what their needs are and how we modify our standard. It's customer facing kind of with other subject matter experts. And then once we kind of complete that, we design and build it. And those are my responsibility as well. But I have other senior individuals underneath me kind of carrying out the construction execution.
Yeah.
So
quite a broad role and obviously a growing, interesting company by what I know in the market. So I suppose from your perspective, obviously, you give us a bit of a background. We're talking about, what a data center was when you first started in the market and where we are today. Obviously, we know the explosive growth. Where do you kind of see data centers heading in the next 3 to 5 years? Obviously, we'll talk through the podcast and that, but at a high level, where do you see data centers kind of heading?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Filtering through a lot of the noise, we're seeing. I feel like, especially kind of in rural communities, I would say that 3 to 4 years ago, I remember being in a conference in Northern Virginia, right? And this was right when things were really starting to scale. And people were talking about development there. What does development look like in Northern Virginia? And they were discussing, uh, tearing down uh, retail car lots and stuff like that. And I was just like, hey guys, the scale of what I'm seeing coming and we're talking about now, whether it materializes, is going to, require large swaths of land away from city centers, for frontier model training. It's not going to be, you're not, it's really hard to find more than like 20 to 30 acres contiguous in a tier one metro, even in the suburbs, to where you can build more than one building. And unfortunately, I was kind of right on that. Like I remember literally making that comment on a panel that I was moderating, and people, because I was in Texas, I was working on some energy development, had a 150-acre site or so, and I had my own interests, right? But at that time, no one was like, oh yeah, whatever, right? And I would say starting in like 2023, 2022, 2023, started to see that materialize. And that's actually how I found Provident. Provident is, a developer that, doesn't just develop data centers, they do industrial and master plan communities. And so I was actually doing some early power consulting for them in 2023 on an 800-acre campus, and then, continued the relationship. And so I think, you've heard everyone talk about large sites, and every day you hear about a new multi-gigawatt site, or you hear about Mr. Wonderful site in Canada and Salt Lake City, right? And I mean, there's really challenges with the scale of those and the environmental impact and just the opposition, right?
Yeah.
So I think those are challenging, to gate all the way through. They're very risky. But at the same time, I think I question a bit on how much demand we're going to have from really like frontier model training facilities, and how many people are invested in these really large remote campuses. And Provident has done a great job over the last 4 years kind of developing those campuses, but we think we're starting to see a switch back to single tenant facilities that value latency, value being around and close to eyeballs, right? And that's not a new trend. It's just one that isn't really talked about. And I think there's coming use cases that are finally going to materialize to where you'll see more brownfield development. I wouldn't necessarily call them edge facilities. I'm not talking about like 1 to 2 megawatt edge facilities that everyone's talked about the use case for like over a decade, but just reinvestment in, mid-sized facilities that can support inferencing, at the edge. So
yeah, I think I think we're already seeing quite a bit of brownfield development. We obviously quite close to working with different customers, and we hear the word brownfield more than we did previously. Do you know what I mean, in terms of from our customers? And I think obviously you'll probably see it already. People don't understand the work that goes into a pre-development of one of these 300 megawatt facilities. Like 3 years, and then you've got to build the thing and get it commissioned. Right. Exactly. So you're talking six years probably end to end there, aren't you? And sometimes that's the financing and the procurement on that is.
If a moratorium isn't passed like halfway through pre-development, right? So it is interesting when you look at single tenant brownfield facilities. You might have environmental remediation depending on what was there, asbestos abatement for demo, but generally speaking, depending on the area you're in the country, you have a quicker path to power, confirmed power. And then, we could talk more about it a little bit, but I typically see kind of like the full pre-development execution, schedule being closer to 3 years, ideally for us, right? So anything that we're starting right now in our pipeline, mid 2026, it would be great to deliver it in 30 months. And that's possible. It's not possible for a hyperscale facility unless you're throwing up metal buildings, and you're building something that isn't, necessarily fit for like a 40 to 50-year lifespan. So
Yeah. So do you think, you're right, maybe 3 or 4 years ago in your predictions, do you think in 5 years time there will still be hype, there's still going to be them, but just not to the extent that we're seeing today? Or do you think that, yeah, and you think there'll be more kind of, like you said, smaller brownfield facilities that would maybe take over?
yeah, I think it's just like, I don't know. I have to be careful what I say about hyperscale, facilities and use cases, right? But it's like, I think if you were to do some due diligence on, like, this is an interesting thing, like basically wholesale, rent rates, like in West Texas versus the tier one, Dallas submarket. This isn't something I focus on per se, but I kind of understood that um, it's riskier to develop and finance, even for an investment grade tenant, a large site in kind of the middle of nowhere, right? Because if they exit, who's going to take that, right?
Yeah.
And so, what really isn't driving the rental rates, the capex isn't. Like as an engineer, like I've been doing this for 15 years, and a lot of it was retail co-location renovations, greenfield, 40 to 60 megawatt sites that were multi-tenant. Really the capex and obviously like the underwriting would affect that. You know, how much could we develop something and how much could we charge someone? What will the market bear? What's our cost, right? Well, at the end of the day, just the uncertainty over who could be a future tenant if the primary tenant leaves after 5, 10 years, really affects kind of like the risk that the capital partners are taking. And that in
Yeah.
itself will drive the actual rent, right? And so it's not cheaper to build in a rural area. One, because of like labor shortages, location, to population centers, but two, the potential risk that, if that tenant leaves, you're not going to be able to release it, right? So
Yeah,
I think,
to be honest, that's a great point. I never really thought, obviously, like, with that, but isn't, it's like anything in life. If you're in a 70 floor, office facility and it's built for one customer in the arse end of nowhere, if
right,
they
right.
leave, you're ultimately somebody else gonna drive and take that facility. Probably not. So it's yeah, really interesting point. I think it's something that's maybe overlooked a lot in day to day.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And the only reason I'm bringing it up is I just think it's something I never thought about, right? I would consider myself a subject matter expert in data center development and commissioning, not operations, not an area I really want to get into, right? That's challenging in its own right. But I never really, I didn't truly appreciate like the risks that developers and capital partners were having to take and decisions they have to make to win a deal, and never truly understood what was driving rental rates, right? Other than just demand. Like everyone's like, oh, well, there's no vacancy, right? Well, alternatively, if you're going to do a build to suit, in an unincorporated area, who's cutting the check for that, right? And I think you'll see a lot of hyperscale tenants are not doing so. Like even the large hyperscalers are using debt and credit facilities to kind of build these facilities, and so that impacts the cost to develop the site. So anyway,
Yeah, no, interesting. So, for you're a leader, have been for a number of years in the space. What's the biggest challenge? I know you've got quite a overarching view of the industry. What do you feel like the biggest challenge like leaders are facing in the industry right now?
well, I think everyone for the last like probably since mid 24 has talked about power, right? Like I've kind of missed the boat on this, potential personal investment, but like all of the Bitcoin mining companies, that basically pivoted um, to, wholesale co-location developers over the last 2 years. Like every single group has kind of, even ones that I hadn't heard of, have kind of made that transition, and they've been very successful, right? So power, has driven almost every decision for the last 24 months. I was kind of thinking about this a bit. Like, again, we're talking about what's the future, 2029, 2030, it's right around the corner. But in 2024, like when I was still consulting, I was working for some reputable developers, in the space that have large operation and sales teams, right? They've been executing for years on a playbook. And you kind of started seeing, just a rush to power. It didn't matter what it was, converting metal buildings, because what had happened is you had GPUs that were being delivered that had nowhere to go. And really, the depreciation of those GPUs was more important than site selection, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. And so it was literally just the Wild West. I learned a lot. I was able to work on a couple of very large AI facilities, that it wasn't a 6-year time frame. It was like 24 months, right? It was very challenging, crazy. Look back at it saying, I wouldn't want to do that again, right? So learn from it. I think power is still a challenge, but you're seeing more appetite to go behind the meter if there's a grid connection coming at some point. I'm not a big proponent of like islanding a facility. It's not something that I think most of my old clients and or our tenants or like our team we don't want to run a power plant, right? Like
Yeah.
if we have a path to a grid connection, then that's something we would look at. Or, if you have an interconnect and then you add behind the meter, that to me is something that makes a lot of sense. And I think you're seeing some success on the large scale sites. But I think all facilities now here in 2026, are finding themselves, having to educate, other constituents, right? City council, planning and zoning boards, your average taxpayer on, the benefits of data centers in their community, but also, listening to how we can adjust our development so that, it works for them, right? And so I think really that is the biggest challenge. That's killing most of the deals that don't make it through our gating process. It's not necessarily power is the number one driver now. And I think it's really interesting. I think there's right ways to develop a large or small
Yeah.
campus and poor ways to go about it. We could probably talk about that a little bit. So
Yeah, it's funny you say that. So do you think like obviously, again at a high level, you don't really hear about the data set. There's obviously a lot of political pushback, etc. But the main thing that I always hear, can we get power? If we do, then we're kind of sorted and we'll crack on. But you're saying that ultimately today you feel like the biggest pushback is still political, like that's kind of taken over from power almost in the new
yeah, it,
developments.
it, it just takes longer, right? Like whereas,
Yeah.
again, just not to tie back to Dallas Fort Worth Metro, but there's a lot of single tenant, single building facilities in a lot of the northern metro areas, right, that were recently developed. Plano, Frisco, um, Las Colinas,
Yeah.
and then some. You see basically some brownfield sites in Richardson that were old, manufacturing sites. But a lot of the southern suburbs haven't had a large data center presence, and then the ones west into kind of the Fort Worth area, they're not used to it. They don't see them as much as we do in the northern suburbs. And you coming from my position, when we find a site that is maybe at end of life, right? Maybe it was developed 50 years ago, has had multiple uses, but that building no longer, needs to be taken down and redeveloped. If it's in a commercial and industrial area, that to me looks like a great opportunity to redevelop that site and add significant dollars to the tax base and actually improve the look of the area, right? And again, I've been doing this for 20 years, so I'm like, oh, that's a perfect site. But it doesn't mean that you don't have a lot of educating to do, especially just with everything you see in the media. Maybe a site that's an order of magnitude smaller than Stargate, you think would be great, for a community in a tier one suburb, right? But
Yeah.
there's still people that live nearby and have concerns, about noise, generator emissions, you know, um, construction, right? Like when we talk, like, and I try to listen to all these, right? Because it's like, I've got to look at it from their point of view, right? This is a partnership we're making with the
Yeah.
community. And it's like, I think construction's really cool, right? Like it's the funnest thing about my job, other than interacting with clients and solving their problems, is getting a chance once or twice a week to go out to a large scale campus that's in construction, and bring friends and family or other people out to tour it, right?
Yeah.
But that is not fun. Let's just be realistic. If you live like a half a mile from the site or a quarter of a
Yeah.
mile from the site, maybe once it's done, you know, you'll be okay with it. But the construction disruption for 24 months is not something that's fun to deal with, right? So there's just ways that developers address those things and plan developments. And what we try to do is listen and respond and incorporate comments, right? And yeah, we're seeing a lot of the large unincorporated land sites that we have in development definitely take a lot of work to get the community on board, right? But so do the 10-acre infills that are adding a lot of positives to the tax base, as well as like potentially what's already there. And that's something I hadn't been exposed to, like as a consultant. I wouldn't go to pre-development hearings, et cetera. We would be engaged like literally when everything's buttoned up and then it's time to rock and roll and
Yeah.
design. So it's
Interesting.
not my primary role at Provident, but for the inference platform, where single building, they're moving quickly. There's a lot of engineering decisions around it. I typically get involved in
Evolve.
those. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also obviously difficult because I think I feel like I say this all the time on this podcast that like the education piece to wider society is something that needs the whole industry to kind of address. Like we need to get better at educating people from outside the industry of what I suppose a data center actually does, what the benefit is to people day to day. And I think but obviously the one thing that probably we see more is well, these AI facilities, they're here to take your job and stuff like that, and that's just the nature of humans, right? We'd love to talk about the negative of things, but logging into your bank, working from home, being you
Right.
doing this podcast, it wouldn't be feasible without ultimately having a data center in place. Do you know what I
And
mean?
yeah, and I think just to communicate, like we really value the community engagement on the sites that are in
Yeah,
pre-development for us. Um, every site is, some sites are not going to get through the process, right? It happens, right? And I think a lot of taxpayers that don't have data centers in their city now, whether that's a rural site in Pennsylvania or an infill site in a tier one metroplex, they just haven't been exposed to it, right? And um, you know, a lot of what they're early on looking, I believe they're looking to just kind of take control back to a certain extent. Like they want to make sure that their voice is heard. And if the city council, planning and zoning, and the developer can truly listen and then respond in kind, I think those projects have a real opportunity to move forward. But if you don't take that approach, I think in 2026, 2027, you're likely not going to be successful.
yeah.
And so, anyway, that's kind of been my recent history on a couple of developments in our pipeline here in the Metroplex. So
Yeah, no, that's yeah. So I suppose obviously we want to talk a lot here about, edge data centers and things like that. So like how I suppose how would you design an edge data center to allow kind of flexibility for the life of the facility, but also create something that, we just talked about the community will support.
yeah, I think that's kind of important. Like, we'll get questions about who's the tenant for this facility. And as you probably know, Sean, in talking to other clients, like one, you either may not be allowed to disclose that, which is changing, right? I think
Yeah.
a lot of the larger tenants are like, hey, let's not hide behind NDAs. We're going to take some more development risk. There's valid reasons for being quiet until you can actually announce the transactions moving forward. Um, uh, but I would say, as far as developing something that's flexible in an edge tier one or tier two submarket, right, and close to carrier hotels, expensive land. Sometimes it requires demolition. It's not a greenfield site. I've kind of tracked this, over the last couple of years. As a consultant, when I wasn't, making, all these decisions about capital risk and allocation, I would challenge, like some of my clients, like, hey, why are we still building a 2 to 3 story facility that could accommodate 15 kilowatt cabinets, maybe 500 watts a square foot, when there's actual use cases out there that, are doing 150 watts a cabinet? Could we shrink these facilities, right? And use less land, right? Use less materials. Why are we oversizing for multiple use cases? And the real reason for that, I mean, there's multiple technical reasons, but I'll get to those. But the real reason for that is, if you're paying a couple $1 million an acre for a brownfield site, in a city center, and you're trying to make the economics work there, the underwriting basically needs to feel confident, one, that there's a path to a 15-year lease, with an investment grade tenant, or a tenant that has an investment grade backstop, um, which de-risks that capital. It kind of turns it into a bond. Um, or it can be. It's not about leasing it initially. It's about, for 30 to 40 years, is this facility going to have a use case, right?
Yeah.
And so can it serve public cloud, right, which doesn't need liquid cooling or GPUs? Can it serve multi-tenant, right, enterprise level customers, which we have all over, most of the, they're all over the place in the tier one, metroplexes currently. And then can it also, effectively deliver to a GPU as a service or high density customer that needs higher floor to floor, right? They have higher cabinet weights and loads, right? And just maybe have just different expectations, right? And so my goal, as the really focusing on product delivery, is taking kind of the 20 years of experience I have, working at all those asset classes, and saying, okay, well, what things do we need to adjust here? And where do we actually need to spend money
Yeah.
that may feel like it's stranded, right? Like someone could challenge me, hey, why do we need a second floor? Can we get rid of it? Right. Well, it's like, if we get rid of it and we don't have any additional land to expand, to release to an air cooled facility, then essentially we've locked ourselves into one computing use in 10 to 15 years. Right. And that increases the risk for our capital partners. And that indirectly will cause the development to cost more per square foot. Whereas actually building the flexibility in, and maybe having room for expansion. Okay, maybe we can bring more power in later. If you don't use, if you utilize high density on level one, that in itself will actually end up paying for the additional cost to build
Yeah.
the expansion space, right? Because the debt structure really moves the needle, not building another 100,000 square feet of space that's, initially not going to be used, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
so, those are the type of things that I work. I'm educating our customers on. What we're building currently is, mainly for high density single tenants, that are, neo clouds or lab facilities, et cetera. And I get questioned like, hey, can we get rid of the second floor? Can we shrink the footprint? And the answer is like, sure, I could do it a certain extent. If I shrink it so tight, I can't reject the heat, right? Without using water, which we don't want to do.
Yeah.
Ideally want to stay away from that. And so those are, kind of the unique things when you look at like AI facilities, um, the challenges they pose developers, right? Um, and then, we
Yep.
also will do a la carte solutions. Hey, do you only need generators for your core network? And maybe the GPU blocks are power conditioned and have battery ride through. I mean, everyone loves that as long as we have space to add them later, right? Like, um, if we come in and tell a planning and zoning board that, hey, we're planning for 30 generators, but we're only going to put 6 in. They like to hear that, right? But we're going to reserve the flexibility and the ability to permit and add those later if like the use case changes.
Right. Okay. So you having to think, you having to use people like yourself who understand where the industry's heading, and like you said, making it so yes, it might only need one floor today, but then we can, if we build a second floor further down the line, obviously that's going to give us a flexibility in the future.
Yeah, and what's interesting, like any development of scale, like a single building might cost $750 million to develop, right? Uh, Obviously, campuses are in the billions of dollars. So just decisions are made so quickly on all of these assets that there's an entire ecosystem of solutions engineers and architects, subject matter experts that all kind of get in a room with a conceptual design package, that hasn't even really been fully designed, hasn't been looked at by a general contractor. And they're signing leases just based on um, going back and forth and trying to de-risk the project on both sides, right? So, uh, you know, one area of opportunity, I know we were going to like talk about this towards the end, that I see for people outside of the data center ecosystem, or maybe you're a college graduate and you're thinking about getting into the space, is you know uh, the sales cycle, and solution has become very technical, and so there's a real opportunity, to kind of come into the space and help, developers as well as their investment partners and the counterparties, like make big picture decisions, early on, in the development that impacts the site development, but that essentially like set the direction for the campus. And you're making those decisions sometimes on a whiteboard, right? And
Yeah,
it
yeah,
would, it would, it would blow your mind, right? But decisions have to be made so quickly, either because the tenant's needs or because the developer has multiple parties that are interested, in the site, right? And there's not necessarily time to go through the traditional process that we used to do for
yeah,
smaller facilities.
yeah. It makes sense, and just so people, because obviously this is a really good case. So, like, how many acres of land do you need per megawatt for kind of hyperscale versus edge?
Yeah, for hyperscale, it's important to us. Like, we might have a 500-acre campus, and we might actually increase our development costs by really densifying the buildings,
Yeah,
to where we have potentially heat rejection issues and concerns, maybe even substation, duct bank cable issues. Because you can imagine if I have, 500 megawatts of load and I've got, 500 acres, I probably want to spread that out to a certain
yeah,
extent, right? As a developer. But, we've actually had some sites that are currently in development where we're consolidating those, right? And really increasing the setbacks as far as we possibly can, so that, the people in the vicinity, are happier with the way it impacts kind of their land, right?
yeah,
And so I think hyperscale, is typically, um, I would say, 1 to 2 megawatt an acre, right? You
yeah,
just literally need more space, and these investments are so large. Like, why would you squeeze everything in, at 5 to 7 megawatts an acre, which might be possible, but it really isn't a good use, of the land and just the sheer investment, right? And room for growth. I would say, urban infills, it really depends on whether or not you're building a substation. If you're taking power off of like a local substation, you could really start to densify that site. I think I had uh, a site that I finished a couple of years ago that was a 9-acre expansion that also had a detention pond, and we went 3-story, and it was 60 megawatts of critical load, right?
Right.
So, and so yeah, so you could probably more like 2 to 5 is a
Right.
reasonable kind of starting point. But obviously the land costs more, so you need to build a little denser. And normally, if you're in an urban infill, there's already Costco's and Walmarts and other things right around you, and so you don't have to be, setbacks and line of sight isn't as big of an issue as a hyperscale campus might be.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. And what drives them numbers?
Um, it's well, at some point, you can't if you go too high, you literally can't reject the heat, from the chiller or dry cooler plant. You're going to run into problems if that makes sense. So you can't
Yeah.
do like 10 megawatts an acre. That's you might be able to with like literally the IT space, but now the support space. It used to be like IT space and support was 50-50. Well, if you build a bespoke high performance computing facility, I mean, 1,500 watts a square foot. I mean, you actually need more support space than the
You
actual
do.
IT space,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it comes down to heat rejection, and then also, like you said, if you build so dense, what are you going to do with it? Like if it's not liquid cooling anymore, and it wants to kind of be traditional uh, air cooling, well, now you've locked yourself in. That's the only use you have for it. So you can definitely drive it up a little bit more in urban areas, just because if you're down in like the city center area, there may be zero setback requirements, right? And all the buildings in that area look like that, and no one has a problem with it, right?
Yeah.
The land value is too expensive for the development code to require like huge setbacks, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And what are the expectation for kind of acoustical levels on a typical infill site?
I think that's changing, right? Like, part of uh, you know, city development organizations, over time they make changes, right? They listen to their constituents, they learn, you know, from,
Yeah.
what they, their development code isn't static, that's for sure. Most industrial sites typically don't have an issue, sites that are industrially or commercially sound, generally speaking, if they haven't had recent development code changes, because of acoustical concerns, normally are like probably 70 dB at the property line, 70 to 75. Um, in master plan, you know, uh, uh, cities like City of Plano,
Yeah.
they require like 55 dB at the property line, and that can all be achieved, right? It's something that we have tools as a developer, to greatly reduce, the noise from the chillers, which are running 24/7, and then the generators that are a pretty large concern, but in all reality only run, hours a year, right?
Yeah.
So it's something that on every development site we kind of have some in-house tools where we run initial acoustical models, you know, to kind of start making decisions on how dense we should build or can we build, but then we validate through professional acoustical engineers when we kind of get closer to presenting the site,
Yeah.
to the AHJ. So I think that's an area where there's a lot of concerns, but fortunately we have a lot of tools. But I do see us designing well below um, the noise ordinance if it's as high as 70 to 75 dBA, because we can kind of just do it with our standard build, and it doesn't add a lot of cost. And we want to be good neighbors, right? Like we want to
Yeah.
reduce noise pollution where we can.
Yeah. And obviously we're talking about, edge facilities. How much water is actually needed at the site? Like, when we're referring to it.
Yeah, this is something that comes up at like almost every um, hearing we're involved in. Is are you what are you going to use at the site, right? Are you requesting water? And not to get into power generation, right? Because there's depending on whether you're using solar, wind, res- reciprocating natural gas engines, or
Yeah.
you might be using cooling towers, to reject the heat at the power source. Generally speaking, it's kind of funny. I've done a lot of work in Texas, and Phoenix, not a lot of water, potable water. Everyone's already concerned about it, and so I actually in the past 20 years haven't designed a site in Texas that actually used evaporative cooling. Right now,
Right. Okay.
cooling towers. Right now, there
Yeah.
are some groups out there that might use direct adiabatic, which is essentially just evaporating very limited amounts of water that cool the air down, no different than when you're sitting on a patio. But
Yeah.
generally speaking, every development that we're looking to do, we're typically looking to use closed loop cooling, where we have to fill, at the start of the project, and then that water's treated and it's used for 20 to 30 years. And so I was at a planning and zoning. We're presenting a project for a site similar to what we're talking about, and we're committing to using closed loop cooling, and we actually expect the water use at that site to be less than it currently is for like a call center, right? So,
Oh, right. Okay.
so it's
So, so it is
unfortunate.
possible to, because you hear about how much water in these facilities, but it is possible to obviously get it to quite a low level, really, is what you're saying.
Yeah, unfortunately, from there are some areas in the country where there's plenty of reclaimed and potable water. So the Great Lakes areas, Northern Virginia doesn't really have water scarcity issues. But then there's other areas of the country, like where there actually are water scarcity issues, but it's a great climate for evaporating. Salt Lake, Phoenix, New
Yeah.
Mexico, and in all reality, from 2010 to 2020, there were a lot of large hyperscale facilities that were developed that use cooling towers or direct adiabatic cooling. Um, I would just say that everything that's getting developed right now that wasn't already entitled, the majority of it is going to be closed loop cooling, or it's going to be some version where the water temperatures in the building are so warm or so high for liquid cooling that you can literally reject the heat without chillers the majority of the year, and then you know a few hours out of the year you might basically spray water on the radiator or which is on your car because you can no longer reject it without either adding a
Yeah.
compressor or evaporating water. And so all the sites that we're developing would be closed loop or very low water use. And
Right.
so, but generally our standard is for closed loop cooling, and that's important to especially the developments in Texas that we're working on,
Yeah. I think,
the infill sites.
I think again, educationally, like everybody thinks these facilities use like I know the like an insane amount of, but you're saying like some of them the same as like a call center or something like that, which is obviously like yeah, something you don't really hear about a lot. Again, it's just an educational piece, really. I think more than anything.
Yeah, and I've seen more. I think um, we as developers and operators, historically have not talked about our facilities that are in development for various reasons, right? It's to gain a
Yeah,
competitive edge. You don't want to lose the power. I think when we go to conferences and stuff, you'll hear a lot more about, ways that we're improving efficiency and reducing water use. But that information hasn't really been shared with the broader public, right?
yeah,
If you go to Data Center World, you're going to see 4 to 5 presentations, on water use, right? And should we use it? Should we not use it? What are the alternatives? Um, if you use water in limited capacity and responsibly, you reduce the power consumption, right? Of the building, which indirectly may reduce the water at the generation source, right? And so the easiest way to not impact a local development and just say, and local water use, is to say, well, we're going to do closed loop cooling. And we'll write that into some of the PDs. We'll commit to essentially we're not allowed, to use evaporation at all, right? And we're very open to that for the right uh, projects. And in fact, one of the hyperscale campuses we have in Missouri is all closed loop, right?
Okay.
So because it's hard to get, sewer and water, you have to put lift stations in. So obviously reducing water use can be very advantageous in an unincorporated area or an area that's just starting to be developed.
Yeah, yeah. And obviously we talked about obviously you're now more involved in planning schedules, etc. But can you kind of walk me through, because obviously it's really good for people listening who maybe aren't involved in that stage, and the typical planning schedule, like the due diligence, permitting, commercial negotiations, etc. Like how does that all work?
Yeah, I would say typically like as a developer, like we actually have land that we already own, right? Or we might redevelop, right? Because Providence been around for 40 years here in Dallas, Fort Worth. But as a developer, typically you're getting an option on some land, whether it's brownfield or greenfield, and you have to kind of de-risk that process before you close on the land, right? And I would say it's pretty normal even for like an infill site, with the power challenges we have, as well as just permitting, and if it's not data center by right zoned, normally we're asking for like 12 to 18 months, an option period, to work through that process and kind of keep the existing owner up to date on it, right? And so, it could be faster if you have a site that already has a building on it that is fit for purpose, right? You might find a spec industrial building that's fit for purpose. Maybe the due diligence process isn't 12 to 18 months, it's 6 months maybe. But then at some point during that 12 months, a developer might kind of start taking some additional risk in hiring and spending dollars outside of the organization to develop the design, to develop renderings and make sure that it can get through planning and zoning and permitting. But yeah, really, I would say you're looking at like 12 to 18 months for due diligence and design. Could that be accelerated some? Yes, right. And then you're looking at probably 12 to 14 months for construction, right? So somewhere between 24 and 30 months for a smaller site, and then with these larger sites, in a year or two, right? Maybe more, right? So
What was that? Sorry, just what?
Oh, for the larger sites, right? So I think it's like I think a infill site, you might be looking at 24 to 30 months from like when we say, hey, this is a site that we want to develop, to actually turn it over, right?
And give it to the operator, basically. Yeah.
Exactly, right. And it could be faster if you already have a building that's
right
fit for purpose, right?
Yeah.
Or you don't have to build a substation. Hyperscale sites typically are raw land and may not have services, we may need to do horizontal developments for traffic studies. We may have to bring sewer, water, build a substation. I would say that's typically like 24 to 36 months of pre-development, right? Before you start moving dirt.
Construction.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. So you probably double almost, aren't you?
I think you're double. Yeah. And like, unless there have been sites that have moved faster than that, right? Like you think about Stargate, it was quicker than that, but that doesn't mean that, I think that's,
breaks the norm a little bit, doesn't it?
It breaks the norm, right? Yeah. Which is, I haven't been out there to tour it. I've asked, some of our partners if I could sneak out there and take a look at it with a different hard hat on. It would have been easier when I was a consultant to get a tour, right?
Yeah.
But I think there's been some pretty remarkable developments over the last 24 months. And I think moving forward, I think a lot of developers and tenants are being given more time to make, the right decisions. It's not just, you know, um, build it as fast as you possibly can. I think the supply chain has grown, um, to kind of support, um, just the proper development process, right?
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously great insight to be fair on obviously and obviously all of that. Obviously something you've probably been involved in more recently. And the kind of one of the final questions, like which up and coming technology would you say is going to have the biggest impact on data centers as a whole?
Yeah, I think there's some interesting opportunities. Every data center installation or every commercial development is going to have an impact, not even just data centers on, our green space, the environment, right? That's um, generally speaking, that comes with progress, right? And we do our best to limit it, right? But I think when we specifically talk about edge or large edge use cases in distributed computing, um, you know, I hear people and I watch podcasts and on data centers in space, right? And you can do distributed compute,
Yeah,
and you could send connectivity back and forth to GPUs that are orbiting, and then send it down, back to a data center at the ground, or whatever that is. And I just think that that's a cool idea, but I think that's quite a ways out, right? I think we will see at scale. I think we'll see nuclear technology on large campuses prior to that. I think there's just a lot of challenges with you know how do you service um, a compute node in space when something breaks. Yes, we have robots, et cetera, but how do you
yeah,
reject the heat? How do we manage? I mean, yes, space is vast, but how do we manage all those satellites? There's already a lot of concern about just the amount of space junk, that's been, satellites that are no longer,
in use.
in use, right? I actually think that if putting facilities, at large bodies of water, oceans, et cetera, close to the coast, where it makes sense, is probably less technically challenging than putting them into space, right? Like I've seen
Yeah,
proposals, for like tanker ships that might have modular high performance compute containers on them, right? And if done responsibly, they can reject the heat, essentially to a large body of water. They can move around. They can communicate back to land. I think if either of those really start to pick up speed, that's going to drastically probably impact, my role as a developer, right? Like if it's modular compute and it's something that someone's launching into orbit, I'm not sure what my value proposition would be, right? When I kind of explain what I do for my job, right? Like I don't design like the compute and the storage equipment and a
yeah.
product. I design everything around it. And so, I might be biased, but I think that's a challenge that, we might see more traction, but to scale it, I think has
Yeah, I
some real
think
challenges.
obviously the idea of them in space, obviously in some ways makes sense, right? But then, like you said, logistically and the challenges, like, yeah, I think like anything, I think it's but obviously a lot of capital being invested into it. You don't really have to look at some of the companies that have raised, billions of dollars in such a short space of time. But I think actually them, like you said, doing it at scale is kind of a different proposition, because then what would happen with all the facilities on land? What happens with all the, yeah, I think it's quite complex just to transition from land to space and at scale, like you said.
I mean, I do think we'll see more distributed compute. So, you could commingle like 10 to 25 megawatt facilities. And I'm kind of speaking out of turn here because I don't do the machine learning, like network design, et cetera. But, I've heard people talk about that. Well, data centers in space is just an offshoot of that
Yeah.
idea. And I think we can do it on land, and it's not easy to find sites that will work. But I think it's easier to do that currently than figure out how to, engineer around the challenges of, suborbital satellites, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of cool
Yeah.
though, right? Who knows?
Yeah,
Like,
no,
I'll make,
the industry evolves, doesn't it? Like I'm sure, like you said, your role 5, 10 years time will probably look quite different than it does today. And I think that's just because it did 5, 10 years ago, it probably looked different than it does today. So I think the good thing when an industry moves at pace, it obviously creates opportunities. So my final kind of take is obviously, how there's obviously a lot of labor shortage. I think we don't really need to talk about labor shortage power because everyone knows about it, right? How how do people transition into the space? What would you advise if someone wants to transition into the space? How would you do it first and foremost, and then what are the opportunities ultimately out there for you?
yeah. I mean, I think the industry as a whole has done a really good job transitioning, workers, into operations roles, right? So if you just think about groups like Overwatch, was an owner's rep, and then they really latched on to kind of transitioning people out of the military,
Yeah,
to staff facilities. But they've also, I mean, that's not the only thing they do. Like, I know people that have transitioned from the military, Navy nukes, into commissioning, into owners rep roles, into construction management roles. Um, and so I think we've done a good job there. But I do think there's opportunities in the ecosystem outside of that, right? If you're a civil engineer that hasn't worked on a data center campus, or even you get a lot of product engineers that so I interview for opportunities that I'm hiring for on our platform, and it's definitely not a no for me just because someone doesn't have data center experience. Historically in Texas, we've seen with the oil and gas boom cycles, you'll see oil and gas engineers come into what we call AEC development, right?
yeah,
And so I've been kind of through that, but I've also seen kind of more what I call product engineers. So when I talk with college grads that want to work at SpaceX or NASA, or they want to work on a product, and they really enjoyed that, but at some point, your goals and what you think is interesting changes. I've been approached by individuals that are very technical, right? At product design and delivery, but
from an
maybe aren't.
electrical mechanical standpoint, or
Yeah,
or
yeah, yeah, yeah. So
yeah,
like from either one of those, right? Where maybe they were working more on like circuit theory,
yeah,
or recently an individual approached me that was wanting to move into the data center space. He was a PhD in mechanical engineering, has worked, for 10 years since he got that. I mean, just you could tell he's just brilliant, right? And I was like, hey, I don't really have a role for you right now based on where our platform is at. But, he was wanting to kind of get some guidance on how we can transition into the data center space out of more of like a PhD product role, right? And eventually, potentially maybe see a path to where he works for a hyperscaler, kind of helping deliver their portfolio, right? And so I was able to just kind of give him feedback, like, hey, I wouldn't do this, I would do that. And also I just like to listen to, like, one, if someone wants to come into our industry and be a champion, listen to kind of like what their concerns are, their personal concerns, and try to give them guidance on how they can be successful.
yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but I think some of the challenge, right, is those individuals kind of have to find a way into the ecosystem
Yeah.
before they would be a great potential candidate. You know, and I know you probably speak to all kinds of different individuals, but a lot of groups out there want, hey, I need 3 to 5 years of data center experience. Otherwise, it's a no. Um, I just want to tell other individuals out there that have interest, this, we don't see a slowdown in data center development right now. Maybe it's not going vertical like this for the next 20 years. Maybe it stabilizes out like it has been for the last 15 prior to the last 5, but there are opportunities, and you can find your way into a job where you just are able to learn from others, and then just keep on looking for growth opportunities in the space. And so,
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any other comments, Sean, because this is kind of
No, I think I've helped people transition from different sectors, etc. And I think it does depend on company to company. Like, it does depend on company to company. Some companies are like, we need data center experience. Others are like, I actually don't want it. Someone's got data center experience, like just putting 12 months on the resume, the salary expectation increased by 50K. And so there are actually nuances in both camps. I think the main thing that I always say is, one, I spoke to a chap last week. He was actually working as like an engineer in the space industry. He's now transitioned. He's now a director at a big owners rep company in 2 years. So he obviously networked a lot. He did a lot of he learned about the industry through through his own passion to join the industry. He actually was brought he was from Virginia, so we kind of in that boom cycle. So I think that networking element is really important, obviously, but do your own research, listen to podcasts, listen to things, try and have build relationships with people who've been in the industry a long time, because it is difficult to get into the industry. When you're in it, I think it's a fantastic industry to be in ultimately.
I think we're in alignment. Like, where I recommend people with no experience to go is to go to a consultancy that can find value, right? Because and that might need to be a bigger group, right?
Yeah.
Not a boutique firm, or an owner's rep firm, right? Because there you're going to be exposed to multiple tenants, multiple developers.
Yeah.
You're going to grow faster. I don't typically recommend individuals pivot to a small OEM, like that only does cooling, or only does chillers, because, you're going to learn, but you're not going to be exposed to like just the different
wider
ways
ecosystem. Yeah.
So I think what you hit on, like anyone we'd be looking to hire for our development team, a consultant, an owner's rep, or someone in construction. Those are all construction's a little harder because you're going to get put on a single project for 2 years. You're not going to work on 6, right?
Yeah.
And so I think those are great areas for people that are already competent construction managers or engineers, to transition in, is target consulting or owner's representation, to kind of really jumpstart your career and transition.
Fantastic. Well, I think we could have talked for another 2 or 3 hours, and we didn't even discuss the World Cup or anything, did we? Unfortunately. So yeah.
Well, we'll have to have a follow up in
exactly
6 months. But yeah, good luck on the game tomorrow. I'm hoping. I think it's a pipe dream, but I think we'll get to the quarterfinals. But I'm really hoping that the Stars and Stripes make it back to Dallas. It's going to be a really expensive ticket, but I mean, you guys are on the complete opposite side of the bracket, right?
Yeah.
So
it's bucket list, right? Though, like I was fortunate. England played in the Euro final like 2 years ago, and it was one of them. I got offered a ticket for the final. We're in the final, and I was like, I've got to go. I've got to get myself over there and go. So I think, it'll be interesting. This will actually probably be aired after the game. So let's see if your prediction rings true.
I had this set up, but I didn't like the way it looked. So
amazing. Well, thanks so much for your time, Mason. I think you've been a fantastic guest. Really appreciate you coming on, and your thoughts have been excellent, especially around like edge data centers and the future in that kind of remit.
Yeah, I appreciate you contributing, your time to educating people, about job opportunities and just the ecosystem in general, right? So thanks for having me on.